Okay, hello everyone, and thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Climate Change, Conflict and Displacement, the Role of Human Rights, with Professor Sumudu Atapattu of the University of Wisconsin. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director for the Zorian Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. This session is kicking off Zorian Institute's fourth installment of its Genocide and Human Rights webinar series. And it is actually our first themed installment of the series, and it's centered around the subject of climate change and its relationship to human rights. You can access all of the recordings of our past sessions on our website, and my colleague Allison will be sharing the link for this in the chat box for you. So in addition to today's highly anticipated session, we have a very exciting lineup for you in the coming weeks. We have a webinar on ecocide and human nature dualism, a session on water scarcity and Indigenous water justice movements, one on the role of human rights, citizen suits, and domestic courts in limiting dangerous climate change, and our final session on changing geopolitical borders and the future in the face of climate change. Again, the webpage to learn more, it's actually the same link to learn more about these upcoming sessions and to register for these upcoming sessions will be shared with you in the chat box. So a few housekeeping items before I give our host a proper introduction. If you have any questions throughout the webinar today, please post them in the Q&A box, or you're welcome to raise your hand and ask your question out loud during the Q&A session. So there will be a 20 to 30 minute Q&A session at the end of today's presentation to address some of these questions. And if you have any questions that are specific to the Institute and its work, you're welcome to ask them in the chat box, or you can send us an email at admin@genocidestudies.org. So now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker for today's webinar, Professor Sumudu Atapattu. Professor Atapattu received her Master's of Laws and PhD from the University of Cambridge, her attorney at law in Sri Lanka, and is a teaching professor and the director of research centers at the University of Wisconsin Law School. She is the executive director of the Human Rights Program at UW-Madison, lead counsel for human rights at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and affiliated faculty at the Roel Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights. She has published very widely, including several books on climate change and human rights, international environmental law, and environmental justice. In today's webinar, she will examine the link between climate change, conflict, and displacement, and what role human rights law can play in protecting the rights of people. So Professor Atapattu, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I would like to thank you, Megan and Allison, for inviting me here today. So let me share my screen. Okay, as Megan said, I'm going to talk about climate change, conflict and displacement, and the role of human rights in protecting people. This is the outline that hopefully I will get to. So I would like to, before I get into the nexus between climate change and conflict and migration, I would like to talk a little bit about climate change per se. I know all of you know what climate change is, but there are some things that everybody agrees on. Some, of course, as you know, there are skeptics too. As well as deniers. We won't go there, but I just want to put this in context and look at some of the consequences of climate change, and then get into the nexus between climate change and conflict. Also looking at climate refugees, because this is a new area of refugees we are looking at. And also consider climate change as a security issue, why security experts are concerned about climate change, and then look at climate change as a human rights issue and the role human rights law can play um, in relation to climate change, and also compounding the challenges. We know that not all states and not all groups are equally at risk. So we will look at some of the groups and states that are particularly at risk or disproportionately affected. And I will conclude with some thoughts. So this is the summary of my presentation. We know that we have far-reaching consequences of climate change, from sea level rise to resource scarcity. Um, Climate change can undermine many of the rights that we take for granted, and have far-reaching implications, not just for the present generation, but for generations to come. And that, again, is a complexity that we need to bear in mind. And added to that, climate change is making many places uninhabitable, which will trigger mass movement of people. People are already moving as a result of climate change. And many scholars believe that resource scarcity can trigger conflict, which in turn can give rise to displacement and refugees. So in this presentation, I will look at the link between climate change, conflict, and displacement, and what role human rights law can play. So what do we know about climate change? We talk a lot about climate change. There's a lot of information about climate change, but are we on the same page when it comes to the impact and what's actually going on, right? The Earth is warming, we know that, and temperatures have already warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius since the Industrial Revolution, right? Think about that for a minute. Let that sink in, because this is a permanent increase in temperature, not day-to-day fluctuations we see in weather, right? So the Earth has permanently warmed by 1.1 degrees Celsius. And the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has very specifically said the evidence is clear, humans are largely responsible for this situation, right? If it is something that's happening naturally, of course, there's nothing much we can do about it, right? But if we are responsible, we human beings are responsible, then we also have a responsibility to do something about it. And the last 4 years, 2016 to 2020, have been the hottest years on record. And for the first time, Western Canada saw temperatures of 50 degrees Celsius last summer. Just think about it, 50 degrees, right? So as I said, we know that climate change is a global phenomenon. It affects everybody, but it will affect some communities and some states more than others. Some for geographical reasons, some due to historic marginalization, poverty, nothing to do with climate change, but climate change will exacerbate these inequalities we see in the internet global community. And we already know that climate change is affecting millions of people worldwide, and millions will be forced to move as a result of climate change. So this is how the global temperatures have increased since the Industrial Revolution, right? This graph is only up to 2000. We are in 2022, and the temperatures are off the chart. And you can see how temperatures have increased consistently since the Industrial Revolution. And I like to show this slide to show the complexity of the problem, because I'm not for 1 minute saying that climate change is an easy problem to solve. If it is, we would have done something about this a long time ago, right? If you look at the emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by sector, you can see that virtually everything we do, every sector of the economy is contributing to the problem, right? We as individuals, corporations, industry, states, everybody is contributing to the problem, right? Electricity and heat production, which is of course connected to other areas like industry, transportation, and agriculture, is the biggest chunk, but every other sector is also contributing, right? So let that sink in, because this is a complex problem, right? So the other question that I grapple with is, how do we frame climate change, right? We know that it has far-reaching consequences, but how we frame the problem has policy implications, right? Is it an environmental issue? Obviously, it is an environmental issue, and it started as an environmental issue. And I think that has implications of how we see that. Is it an economic issue? During 2021 alone, just last year, and in the US alone, there have been over $10 billion severe weather events. Just in 1 year, right? Because US is considered to be the wealthiest country on earth, it has been able to bounce back. But think about other countries, right? Think about the implications of these severe weather events alone. In economic terms, I didn't even mention the human cost, right? Imagine rebuilding after something like this, right? Is it a public health issue? We know that climate change will affect it has already affected public health. So should we frame it as a public health issue, or is it a human rights issue? We know that many of our rights will be affected as a human rights issue. So should we look at it as a human rights issue? Or is it a security issue? We know that, with mass movement of people, resource scarcity, conflicts will arise. So is it a security issue? And depending on how we frame these, different areas of our public institutions will be implicated, right? Security is handled by one section, economy is handled by a different section. Is it all of the above? If it is all of the above, and we know that it is all of the above, how should we tackle it, right? Because we are so used to the silo mentality, as we call it, or compartmentalizing these issues into neat little boxes, right? This is an economic issue. This is a public health issue. So, the Department of Health will be taking care of that. This is a security issue. So the Pentagon or the security people will take care of it. But when it is all of the above, how do we address it, right? And added to that complication, measures we put in place to address climate change could also have other implications, right? In relation to livelihoods, in relation to human rights. So this is a very complex problem. And obviously the solutions will be complex as well, right? So think about how best to frame this. And if there are students in the audience, how will you talk about climate change to your family, to your peers, to your elders, especially, and to policymakers? How will you frame this? So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is working on its 4th assessment report now. It issued a draft last year. And very clearly, it said that we cannot avoid some of the devastating impacts. Forgot to put my timer on. um, it very clearly said we cannot avoid some of the devastating impacts because the lag time between emissions and the consequences is pretty long. We have emitted so much greenhouse gases into the atmosphere that we will continue to see the consequences for at least 30 years. That's what this report said. And these consequences will get worse, right? The consequences are worsening, and we have locked in these consequences, right? We still have a narrow window of opportunity to make the situation stop the situation from worsening, but that window is getting smaller and smaller, right? So we have emitted so much greenhouse gases that warming will continue until the middle of the century, even if we drastically reduce our emissions today, right? So, which means that many of the consequences we see today will continue to get worse for the next 30 years, right? Um, Remember the very first slide, on the very first slide, we saw that Earth has warmed by 1.1 degrees already. So imagine what it would look like if we are already experiencing these consequences now. Um, Imagine what it would be like in 30 years' time. So the report continued that because of the other impacts like melting of ice sheets and glaciers, sea level will continue to rise for at least 2,000 years. That's scary, right? Um, and the other thing that the report pointed out that is that these impacts are happening faster than they predicted, right? Which means that we must learn to live with these consequences, try and minimize the impact on people. And, you know, we are not just talking about people, there are so many animals and other species that are affected. We need to increase the resilience of communities to withstand these consequences and build better infrastructure to withstand these consequences, right? But some communities will have to be relocated. And that's something that the international community will have to look at very, very seriously when it comes to like small island states. The situation is not um, very good because many of the places will become uninhabitable in 10, 15 years time in our lifetime. These communities will have to be relocated, and already some communities are being relocated because of climate change. So the United Nations Environment Program issues what is called the emissions gap report every year. And the last year's report said, despite the commitments states have made, there's a big gap between what is promised by states and what is needed. And this is these are the pledges that states have made to reduce their emissions. Even if you add up all the pledges that states have made, we are headed towards like a 2.7 degree increase in temperature. And scientists have said we should try and limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees. And remember, we have already warmed by 1.1 degrees. So we don't have much wiggle room here. And but we are headed more towards 2.7 to 3 degree increase in temperature if we continue down this path, right? So there's a big gap between what is promised and what is needed, which means that states have to increase their ambition when it comes to the NDCs, nationally determine contributions or the commitments that they have made under the Paris Agreement. So in order to keep the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees, states have to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions 50%, sorry, CO2 emissions 50% by 2030 and 2022, and they have to go carbon neutral by 2050. Think about that. Reduce CO2 emissions 50% by 2030, go carbon neutral by 2030. If we want to keep the temperature increase to 1.5. Beyond that, small island states are going to be uninhabitable. So they pushed really hard to get this 1.5 degree limit included in the Paris Agreement. Scientists have said earlier that a 2-degree increase will be okay. That is the safe level, but it's not the safe level for small island states. But we are nowhere near that goal, unfortunately. So what are the impacts on people, from water scarcity to land degradation and desertification? And we are living through these consequences right now, right? These are not something that will happen in the future. We are already living through these. Food production and food security will be affected as a result of climate change. There will be health impacts on people. Due to water stress and flooding, of course, lives will be in danger. In addition, with increased temperatures, vector-borne diseases are increasing in temperate countries, and they are not used to having malaria and dengue. So that's a big problem. And of course, we are living through a pandemic now. We don't know what other pandemic, and these are zoonotic diseases related to climate change, land use changes, and environmental degradation. So all these are interrelated. Frequency, intensity, and duration of extreme weather events are increasing. We have seen more flooding, more storms, more droughts at the same time because of climate change. Of course, climate change is not the only reason why these severe weather events are happening, but climate change is contributing to the frequency and intensity of these severe weather events, right? We can no longer call these natural disasters because climate change is contributing to it. And then we have wildfires. We have seen more and more wildfires happening all over the world in places where we have never seen them before. And I read somewhere that these firefighters are saying we no longer have a wildfire season. Throughout the year, we have wildfires. The whole year is now a wildfire season, right? Sea levels are rising, which is affecting small island states and low-lying states. And cities, even places like Florida, are getting flooded more and more frequently. And of course, they don't like to talk about climate change, thinking that, that's going to affect their property prices. Not that it'll go away, but, climate change is a taboo subject there. And this affects salinity. Due to salinity, it's affecting availability of water for drinking purposes and irrigation, and mass displacement and conflict are possible. Obviously, if people don't have food to eat or water to drink, they will move. And some communities are already being relocated, even in the United States, or are awaiting relocation. And many of these communities are indigenous people who have an intimate relationship with their land. So many of them don't want to move. So we are already witnessing these adverse consequences, but as I pointed out, not all states and communities are equally affected. And there are many underlying reasons for that. So some pictures looking at Bangladesh, Kiribati, a small island state. These communities are already experiencing a lot of hardship. Some people have started to move to other areas and other countries. And we will talk about some of the refugee applications that people have made. This is from Alaska. This is an indigenous community, Shishmarov, that voted to relocate their entire village, and this is what they are living through. This is Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines in 2013, which is considered as the biggest hurricane to make landfall. So imagine rebuilding after something like this. Imagine the human toll, imagine human suffering as a result of this. Severe weather events associated with climate change. You have flooding, and this is Canada last year, right? Record high temperatures in July. Bushfires in Australia. The year before killed, I don't know, millions of animals. And this is what people are living through right now, right? And people have said climate change adaptation is all about water. Either you have too much or too little, right? This is again what people are living through right now. So, sorry, I didn't mean to sort of paint a really bleak picture of what's happening. But, you know, the saddest part is that this is not science fiction. It's what we are going through and what's to come for the next generation, really. So the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, issued a report in 2020 looking at the link between conflict and climate change. This was more about areas of conflict that are also affected by climate change, not so much how climate change will trigger conflict. But some of the figures are really important. The report said that 200 million people would need humanitarian aid every single year from 2050. And this is in addition to who need humanitarian aid right now, right? And we are talking about millions of people. 20 billion international funding will be needed annually to respond to humanitarian needs by 2030. And we are not talking about, you know, next century. We are talking about a situation in a few years, right? 60% of the 20 countries considered to be most vulnerable to climate change are also affected by climate change. So there's a clear link between armed conflict and climate change. And so this is a double whammy. People are being affected by both armed conflict and climate change, right? Foods crisis. 14 of the 34 countries experience conflict and climate shocks in 2017, right? And over 50% of world's population is expected to live in areas that are water stressed by 2050, right? So that's a recipe for disaster, right? I mean, you need water to live, and if you are living in a place where there's water stress, what do you do? Right? So the report continued about the impact of conflict on people, right? Of course, we know that a lot of civilians die as a result of conflict, but there are so many other scars that people have to live with, right? There's so much social disruption, and it affects poverty, it exacerbates poverty and inequalities. Um, People lose everything they have to rebuild their lives from scratch in some instances, or they're displaced for months. They might live in refugee camps for months. Access to water and food could be compromised. Economy is affected. So when you add climate change, the situation gets um, pretty bad, right? So conflicts cause long-term damage to the environment at the same time. Um, and these issues continue for decades, right? Um, so the report said, like climate change, conflicts are unfair. They increase the vulnerability of people who are already vulnerable, right? Um, think about the current situation. They were showing Afghanistan recently and how people are suffering. They are undergoing uh, a really bad winter. Um, some people don't have proper shelter. Um, so it's a really bad situation. So the political situation is adding to the conflict as well as climate change. Um, so some people consider mobility or movement as a way of adapting to these situations. But we must not forget that not everybody can move. Not everybody is in a position to move to a different place, whether even if they want to, they may be too poor. You need some means to move. Or you might be disabled, or you might be too elderly, or you might have elderly parents that you cannot leave behind, or there may be various social or economic reasons why people cannot move. So if we look at displacement or migration as a way of coping with these consequences, you might ignore the populations that are trapped, who are unable to move for various reasons. So when we talk about these situations, we need to pay attention to these trapped populations as well. So framing migration as an adaptation strategy will ignore these populations. So we need to be careful about how we frame this. And sometimes people move to areas that can barely look after that can barely have the infrastructure to house them. So then they may end up in slum areas that may be hazardous to their health. Children are particularly affected, women are particularly affected. So we need to pay attention to those groups that are disproportionately affected as well. So the ICRC requested the global community to address climate change, to avert disastrous consequences for people and the environment, right? But it recognized that those efforts will only limit the climate crisis, not avert it completely, right? As I mentioned earlier, it's due to the emissions that we already have in the atmosphere. These consequences will continue for decades, really. So what is necessary is to help people, because the consequences will be there. we need to adapt. So these humanitarian agencies have to take measures to help people who are most vulnerable to the climate crisis. And they're also the most neglected when it comes to climate action. So this is one typology of environmental change and conflict. If you look at the resource population balance, often you have overuse of these resources. Environmental change also contributes to it, which leads to resource scarcity. And then when you have more and more people with less and less fewer resources, then there's competition and conflict. And often you also have political reasons or state collapse, which leads to violent conflict and displacement. And displacement can also lead to resource scarcity in the new place. So this cycle might continue. So there's another way of looking at it, climate, conflict, migration sort of nexus. Climate will contribute to drought and crop failures. You also have poor natural resource management at the same time, which will give rise to conflict over resources on the one hand, and demographic pressures in the destination area, because the new area where people move to could give rise to these conflicts, could barely sustain more people. And conflict can give rise to internally displaced persons, refugees, and economic migrants, and migration can give rise to conflict, etc. So this is a vicious cycle that feeds on one another. Many scholars have looked at the link between climate and conflict. But you cannot really say climate change is causing conflict, although there is a link. It can exacerbate an existing situation. So it's very important to pay attention to this link, and more research is needed to see what is sparking conflict, how climate change is exacerbating existing instabilities and giving rise to conflict. But there seems to be growing evidence of the link between climate change, migration, and conflict, which raise plenty of reasons for concern. So we need to start paying attention to these multifaceted crisis scenarios brought about or worsened by climate change. Climate change will disproportionately affect security in least developed countries. Many of these countries are fragile politically, economically, and socially. And climate change will exacerbate these inequalities and fragile situations, right? Climate change is not the only reason for conflict, but it acts as a threat multiplier. And disasters are associated with climate change. We saw severe weather events. And another link that we need to pay attention to is climate change, conflict, and gender. We know that climate change is not gender neutral. Climate change will have a disproportionate impact on women. For one thing, they are engaged in agricultural in agriculture in many parts of the world. They are small-scale farmers. In many societies, they are responsible for gathering water for the family. So climate change has a disproportionate impact on women. At the same time, we know that conflict also has a disproportionate impact on women. Gender is used as a weapon sometimes. Um, in displaced situations, also women face gender-based violence. So neither climate change nor conflict is gender neutral. So this nexus also needs attention. Some have argued that the conflict in Darfur was climate related. The former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said Darfur conflict began as an ecological crisis, um, arising at least in part from climate change. And the United Nations Environment Program has also looked at uh, the link between land degradation, desertification, and conflict in Darfur. So the underlying reasons might be climate in relation to some of the conflicts we are seeing around the world. And if you look at climate change, it can create new tensions or worsen existing tensions, right? Obviously, if resources are declining with regard to water, land, food, it could increase competition for resources, which could lead to violence. Um, and resource scarcity can also cause people to move. And we saw in the chart how these issues feed on one another. And extreme weather events again can contribute to this. And cross-border migration in fragile situations can spark violence as well. So some have said climate change contributed to Arab Spring. Homer Dixon was the first person to sort of bring attention to environmental scarcities and violent conflict. So each National Institute for Strategic Studies have said that climate change is a threat multiplier. Again, it's not the sole reason for conflict, but adds to existing threats. The others have argued that, Darfur was not a climate change issue. The assertion that it was fails to explain why in some communities resource scarcity does not lead to violence while others do. And also it ignores the dysfunctional nature of the political system in Sudan, and also diverts responsibility. If we say that climate change was the reason, then it diverts responsibility from the government's role. And because the government is responsible for protecting rights of people, so it diverts attention from that. So this is a community in Louisiana in the US, an indigenous community that is being relocated right now because of climate change. They are on a small island off the coast of Louisiana, and they are being relocated because their community is it's no longer safe for them to live where they are because of climate change. So essentially, they are climate refugees, although they are being moved within the United States itself. Another community in Alaska, scientists have said that Kivalina, the village of Kivalina, will be underwater in a few years, in 2025, actually. This community is awaiting relocation. There are lots of questions about who should pay for relocation. Where will they go? Remember, this is again an indigenous community. Um, so they cannot move just anywhere they want. And this is like 300 people, not a lot of people, but they are awaiting relocation. So when we look at climate refugees, again, climate change is not the only reason why people move. So because of that, it's very hard to find credible numbers of who will be forced to move because of climate change. So uh, the causal link between climate change and movement is not very clear, but the forecast is somewhere between 20 to 200 million people by 2050. And that's a lot of people within a short span of time. Even if we take the lower number, we are still talking about millions of people. So as we saw, this is a dual phenomenon. Conflicts over resources can trigger migration, and migration can trigger conflicts over resources in the new place. So migration is both the result of conflict as well as the cause of conflict in some instances, right? So although this needs more study, some hotspots may already be visible. So the very first report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said, this was in 1990, mind you, the greatest single impact of climate change could be on human migration. And under current international law, this category of people is not protected. There's no legal definition of climate refugees. So there's a protection gap if they move across borders. Although climate migration will be mainly internal, and some argue that it's temporary, you cannot rule out cross-border migration. And for small island states, relocation en masse will be necessary at some point. Then, of course, there are lots of legal issues associated with that as well. There have been various definitions proposed, but nothing has been sort of legally accepted yet, right? Under the Paris Agreement, a task force on climate displacement was established. Remember, the phenomenon was recognized as a problem as far back as 1990, and it took us 25 years to establish a task force on climate migration. I think I will skip some of this. As we know, the Geneva Convention on Refugees applies only to people fleeing persecution based on the grounds that are enumerated in the convention. So basically, only political refugees are covered. And some people who are coming from Central America claiming refugee status in the US are leaving because of drought and crop failures due to climate change. So are they political refugees, economic migrants, or climate refugees, right? Sorry, did I go through that? Okay. So even if it is internal migration, that gives rise to a lot of disruption and hardship on people. And, you know, some people might have to start from scratch in a new place. After Hurricane Katrina in the US, many people never went back to Louisiana. As I said, some consider migration as a form of adaptation, but we need to pay attention to these trap populations. But there was one recent case decided by the UN Human Rights Committee. This case, Teoda case, was brought by a citizen of Kiribati, against New Zealand, challenging New Zealand's decision to turn down its application for refugee status. Um, and he uh, applied on the basis of being a climate refugee because climate change impacts are causing so many hardships on him that he cannot be sent back. Of course, he was deported, so he made this case to the Human Rights Committee. Although his application was denied, the Human Rights Committee accepted that adverse consequences of climate change could pose a serious risk to life in some instances and could trigger the application of the non-refoulement principle under human rights law. This is separate from refugee law, and so this recognition that this was the first time that a human rights body recognized that climate change could trigger the non-refoulement principle, which means that they cannot be sent back if there's a serious risk to life, I think is a huge development under international law. And we can talk more about it as to why it failed, but the decision was pretty interesting. I think I will skip some of this. Climate change as a security issue, the UN Security Council held a debate on climate change and international peace and security as far back as 2007. And many countries, like small island states, made presentations to the UN Security Council about the impact of climate change. Maldives said, for example, that 60% of habitable land is facing erosion. And Tuvalu said that we are moving from a cold war to a warming war, and their nationhood is at stake. So that's another issue that we can talk about in the Q&A. Again, the World Commission on Environment and Development recognized in 1987 in their report that even impoverished countries are spending far more on their military expenditure than on protecting the environment. And also on social programs like education and poverty alleviation. So it's clear that climate change, conflict, and refugees and mobility have human rights implications. So a few years ago, Mary Robinson, who was then the special representative of the UN Secretary General on climate change, said she believes that climate change is the biggest human rights issue of the 21st century. So although the impact of climate change on human rights is quite obvious, it was not considered as a human rights issue until like 10 years ago. So in 2009, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution on climate change and human rights and requested the Office of the High Commissioner to prepare a report on the link. And the report recognized that almost all human rights will be affected by climate change due to water scarcity, food scarcity, desertification, and severe weather events. It also talked about small island states and climate refugees. So something that we don't often think about is that states have already signed on to human rights treaties that they have to fulfill in relation to the adverse consequences of climate change. So whether the climate change documents refer to human rights or not, states already have this obligation that they have to fulfill. So some have argued that human rights is not a useful framework to apply to climate change. because you cannot really establish the causal link between these historic emissions and the consequences that we are witnessing because of the global nature of climate change, right? But states have duties in relation to mitigation and adaptation, and there are human rights implications as well as in relation to severe weather events. So measures they put in place with regard to mitigation should be looked at from a human rights perspective. Adaptation measures similarly. So although it's hard to adopt a human rights framework in relation to historic emissions, or think about damage to future generations, it's obvious that there are human rights implications of measures states take in relation to mitigation and adaptation, as well as severe weather events. Some of the remedies available may not be sufficient, but um, like if your entire country is disappearing, what kind of remedies would be um, sufficient, right? Will compensation cover it? So there are questions, but at the same time, we know that states have to fulfill their human rights obligations in relation to climate change consequences. The Paris Agreement was the first time that that an environmental treaty referred to human rights. Of course, the language was a little watered down. This was a very controversial, um, became very contentious during the negotiations, but the preamble still refers to um, human rights obligations as well as right to health. And if you look at this long list of rights that could be affected by climate change, you can see why climate change should be considered as a human rights issue, right? Starting from right to life to right to self-determination, right to water, food, sanitation, freedom of movement, even nationality, right? If your whole country is disappearing because of climate change, your right to nationality could be affected, right to culture, particularly when it comes to indigenous people. There's a whole list of rights that are affected by climate change. And as I said, certain groups and countries are more vulnerable than others because of historic marginalization or even geography. Like polar regions are warming twice as much as other parts of the world. So we cannot treat all these groups alike because they suffer disproportionately because of climate change. And of course, the real injustice is that their contribution to climate change is minimal compared to industrialized countries, but the impact on them is much larger. So there have been, interesting developments as well. Many human rights institutions are looking at climate change and pronouncing on the impact of climate change on their rights. The Human Rights Council adopted a resolution last year recognizing for the first time that people have a right to a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment. And this is a huge development. Scholars like myself have been arguing for this for years. And hopefully the UN General Assembly will follow suit and adopt a resolution. But this recognition, I think, is a huge development. In addition to that, CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, the CEDAW Committee has adopted a general recommendation on gender, climate change, and disasters. The CRC Committee on the Rights of the Child is working right now on a general comment on children and environmental degradation, especially in the context of climate change. And there was a very recent decision by the CRC committee where a group of children brought brought a communication against 5 countries, one of which was Argentina. Of course, the communications were dismissed for not exhausting local remedies. But very interestingly, the CRC committee said the global nature of climate change does not absolve states of their individual responsibility to address climate change. So a huge development. Again, human rights experts got together and issued a statement last year to say it's time to move from promises to action. This was soon after the Glasgow COP meeting, but said that, although important commitments were made, they don't go far enough. And states must fulfill their human rights obligations and respect principles underlying right to development in relation to participation, solidarity, etc. When it comes to climate change as well. So, as I said, climate change is a daunting problem and people react in different ways. Some feel overwhelmed, some deny, as we know, some think that, oh, everything will be okay. And I hope everybody here is a solutionist who think that answers can be found and must be found. Actually, we know what we have to do. It's just that, we are not doing enough. So to conclude, it is a complex problem. I'm not trying to sort of undermine the complexity, and it can be seen overwhelming because virtually everything we do contributes to it. Every country in the world, every sector of the economy is contributing. So it has become a huge political issue as well, as we know. But unfortunately, we are fast approaching tipping points from which no return is possible. And we saw from the UNEP emissions gap report that there's a big gap between what is needed and what has been promised by states. So there's an urgent call for action because the longer we wait, the harder the choices will become because we are running out of time. We saw that we have to reduce emissions, CO2 emissions 50% by 50% within 8 years, right? We know that there is a link between climate change, conflict, and migration, but this needs to be studied in greater detail and addressed, right? We also need to address the situation of climate refugees, at least within a regional framework, right? Climate change affects all the protected rights, and states have obligations to protect their citizens from adverse consequences of climate change. We created this problem, right? It's a human-made problem, and I think it's good because not that we created it, but the fact that humans created it, because then we can do something about it. We have an obligation to do something about it. If it is a natural thing, there's nothing much we can do. And I think we owe it to our children and grandchildren to do something about it. So I will stop there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much. That was such an engaging and eye-opening presentation. I really appreciate that. We do have some questions in the Q&A, and we also have someone with their hand up here. So I will go to Catherine. Would you like to ask your question out loud? I'm going to allow you to talk. So you should be able to unmute yourself and ask your question out loud if you'd like. Catherine, are you there? You just need to unmute. Okay, maybe we'll come back to Catherine. We'll go to the Q&A
Okay.
box for a second. Okay, so our first question is, are there any estimates as to how much is being spent on climate change mitigation versus the amount that has been spent in response to severe weather events? And how has the silo mentality impacted this?
Estimates on mitigation versus severe weather events, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
I personally don't know, but I'm sure the statistics are out there, and it's crazy because some of these weather events, run into billions of dollars. And one of the things that we always hear is that, oh, we don't have enough money to spend on mitigation or to spend on adaptation. But yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. If we can show that, we can prevent some of this and, save so much money, um, which we can, then spend on mitigation. So part of the problem, of course, is we are talking about different time scales. Mitigation will not help this generation or the next. It's a much longer term view that we have to take. So we won't see immediate results from mitigation. So that could be one of the reasons why there's so much reluctance to spend a lot of money on mitigation. But we also have to spend so much on adaptation measures too, and help countries that are disproportionately affected, like small island states and low-lying countries, and many of them can barely help their own populations on a day-to-day basis, let alone, build seawalls or whatever that's needed to adapt to the consequences. But yeah, I'm pretty sure the numbers are out there, but I cannot tell you offhand what they are. But it's a really good question.
Thank you so much.
Oh, silo mentality. Yeah, I mean, the problem, I mean, there are ways of getting around it, and some countries have established like interagency coordination bodies and things like that. But part of the problem is if you consider it as a security issue without looking it from the point of view of, say, human rights, the first thing that you do in a security situation is to curtail rights, right?
Right.
You restrict rights of people. So, and that's not a good thing. So that's why it's important to sort of look at this look at this holistically. And the other thing, of course, is, you talk about jobs that will be lost because of climate change, like in the coal industry or in the fossil fuel industry. But you don't really talk about all the jobs that will be created in renewable energy, right? So yeah, I think adopting a holistic approach is necessary, and there are signs that it's happening, but it's not happening at the scale that's needed, unfortunately.
Right. And what kind of measures are governments in small island nations and low-lying areas taking to protect their populations in the face of increased climate vulnerability and slow onset disasters, such as sea level rise and droughts?
Yeah, that's a very hard question because it's a losing battle, right? Some of these measures are temporary. So one of the things that in the Tetiora case I mentioned before the Human Rights Committee, one of the things that the committee looked at was adaptation measures that Kiribati was putting in place to protect people. to help them adapt to the situation. So it begs the question as to whether the application for refugee status would have succeeded if the country was not really engaged in adaptation measures and helping people to adapt, right? Um, so the other issue, of course, is it worthwhile putting these temporary measures in place if people have to be moved at some point anyway, right? Are you just buying time? Is it better to spend that money on something else, to find land for them somewhere to move to? So it's a really hard balance. Small island states are doing a lot, lobbying for more funding to help them. As I mentioned, they lobbied hard to get 1.5 increase included in the Paris Agreement as the target. So they're doing a lot, but at the same time, their hands are tied. They don't have the resources, and they're battling against rising seas. So um, I and the Maldives actually established, constructed um, an artificial island. Um, so is that the way to go? Of course, it requires billions of dollars. And what is the responsibility of the global north, which created this problem to help these developing countries, and particularly places like Kiribati and Tuvalu, Bangladesh is another country that's disproportionately affected, and my own country, Sri Lanka, which is an island, um, which is affected by climate change because people, depend on the ocean for their livelihoods, for recreation, for tourism. So it's problematic. There's so much one can do when you're, battling sea level rise, and as we saw, that's going to continue for the next 2000 years. So how do you
Wow.
how do you deal with that? Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. Another question we have here are there any international frameworks in place for the recognition and resettlement of climate refugees?
No. The short answer is no, because there's no recognition of climate refugees as a category. There's no definition, although there are lots of proposals. One framework that has been adopted called the Nansen Initiative. Again, it's a soft law initiative, but states have signed on to it. That recognizes cross-border movement in the event of disasters associated with climate change, because there you can see the disaster. You don't really have to connect it to climate change. So that's the only sort of framework that has been, it's not adopted by the UN, but it's a soft law mechanism that some states have signed on to. Other than that, some are looking at regional initiatives, like the Pacific Islands might want to move to New Zealand and Australia. It's very rarely that they move across the entire ocean to go somewhere else. So some have said rather than having an international approach, a regional approach might be better. But there's no legal framework uh, in place right now to address the situation.
Right.
Yeah.
And why do you think it has taken so long for climate change to be recognized as a human rights issue after reports warned about the impact as early as the 1980s and 1990s?
Uh, it is a very political issue. And in the United States, we don't really talk about climate change as a human rights issue. really, at least at the political level, but I think the Inuit petition that was brought by Inuit of Canada and the US against the United States in the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights way back in 2005 was the real impetus for the recognition by the human rights community. And again, this goes back to the silo problem that I talked about earlier too. Very rarely people look at these issues holistically. So the human rights community was not really looking at climate change as a problem because it was an environmental problem, right? So the environmentalists were involved in climate change, not so much the human rights community. So the lawyers who brought this case really wanted to draw attention to the problem that climate change was already affecting people. Because again, people thought that this was something that was going to happen in the future. We don't really have to worry about it. But these communities in the Arctic were being affected by climate change. So the lawyers knew that the case was not going anywhere, but they really wanted to draw attention to the problem and to give a human face to it. So from that point of view, I think it was hugely successful, and it got the ball rolling with regard to the human rights community. And barely 2 years after the case was decided, actually the Inter-American Commission held a hearing on the link between the two. The Human Rights Council adopted a resolution, so that really had a ripple effect. Uh, so, as you know, the Human Rights Council also established a mandate for a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change last October when it adopted this resolution on recognizing a right to a healthy environment. So, the human rights community is really into it now. In fact, my current book project, I'm looking at how these human rights treaty bodies and the Human Rights Council are addressing climate change and environmental degradation, although their mandate does not include it. But almost all the concluding observations that treaty bodies have made on states reports refer to climate change or environmental degradation. It's incredible how the human rights community has got involved in this issue because it affects all the rights, all the work that they're doing. Yeah.
That's so true. Hassan says, Dear Dr. Atapattu, thank you so much for this lecture and presentation. Where does the political and economic power struggle for natural resources to make profit stay in framing the climate change?
Multinational companies, the companies that are making profit from the status quo, right? Fossil fuel companies. I mean, obviously, if you're making billions and billions of dollars from the status quo, you don't want it to change, right? And they also have, at least in my part of the world, they have huge political power as well. So they don't want to dismantle the situation. So yeah, I mean, and of course, this goes back to the underlying issue, which is the economic system, the capitalist economic system we have. Everything we do is connected to that, and we are trying to sort of solve the problem by relying on the system that caused the problem. So I feel that it's really short-sighted. But I also don't, I mean, I'm pragmatic enough to know that it's not going away. So it'll be really hard to dismantle this existing system. So yeah, I mean, that's why I feel that it's important to show that this is an economic problem and show all the uh, new jobs that can be created. It's good for your health, you know. So yeah, so that's why we need this holistic approach without relying on just one aspect of the problem.
Thank you so much. A question that was appears in the chat. Can you suggest any articles or books on the environment and human rights, especially on climate refugees, for an undergraduate level classroom?
Um,
Mhm.
there's a lot written on this. I actually did a textbook with another colleague looking at the link between human rights and environment for Rutledge. That would be a good starting point for undergraduates. It was published in 2019.
Okay.
Um, for climate refugees, again, there's a lot written. There's a book, a collected volume by collected essays by Kent and Berman. I have a chapter in that. So that would be a good starting point as well. But both these areas have sort of grown exponentially over the years, and there's a lot written uh, on both topics.
That's great.
Yeah.
Maybe what we can do is those recommendations you just mentioned, I can send it to the participants in an email after the session.
Okay.
They have those links. Thank
Sure.
you so much. Another question we have here from Lauren is, given the current protection gap, what prospects do you believe to be the strongest for extending refugee protection to persons whose displacement has been in some way exacerbated by the climate change? Do you believe that there is a need for us to distinguish protection frameworks as they are tied to persecution-driven human mobility during, i.e. during conflict, and climate or disaster-related drivers of displacement?
Yeah. So I think we need to take the context into account because the current refugee framework was put in place to address the influx of refugees after the Second World War, where persecution was a huge problem. So obviously you cannot compare that situation with climate consequences because there's no persecution. And I think it'll be really hard to sort of amend the existing legal framework to include climate refugees in the refugee framework. There's a lot of sort of pushback on that. At the same time, we do need something to protect these people because they are moving for no fault of their own, right? So I think the current humanitarian frameworks we have in place where people are fleeing wars, even if they are not personally persecuted, would be helpful. So if you are moving because you can no longer live in a particular place, uh, and you have to move across borders because that's the safest place to go, the closest safest place, then I think you should be entitled to some level of protection. Um, but the problem right now that we have is states are getting increasingly paranoid about their borders um, for various reasons. There's so much uh, fear among people. Uh, and this is again a political thing because the fear is instilled in you to say that either these refugees are coming to take your jobs or they are criminals, right? Neither of which is true, really. but that's the mindset we have. So states will do anything in the name of security. So in a way, I feel that framing climate change as a security issue is good in that sense, because money is no limit, right? For war on terror, we poured in billions of dollars. So, maybe it's time to think of climate as a war on climate or something. But the flip side, of course, is that in the name of security, we tend to restrict, curtail a lot of rights. Um, so I feel that states should look at their own, because even if we have an international framework, states still have to amend their national laws to admit refugees, climate refugees. So states should look at their own laws and see how we can uh, expand the existing definitions to admit them and not treat them as criminals. But I think in 10-15 years time, states will have to look at the situation of small island states, and think of ways how to accommodate these people within some semblance of what they currently have, not let them move ad hoc, preserve some semblance of statehood somehow. And the current notion of statehood is a legal fiction that we created, right? So I'm sure the lawyers are smart enough to come up with a legal fiction to accommodate these deterritorialized states. Because many of the people would like to retain their statehood, their nationality. So I think we need to find ways to accommodate that. Um, Rather than look at these people as threats to national security, because they're in this situation because we developed the the industrial countries developed to such an extent that there's an externality of that. So and I think we have a real responsibility to help these developing countries to adapt to this new normal. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor, and thank you to the participants for joining today's session and engaging in this great discussion that we had after the presentation as well. Before we sign off, if you missed any of today's session, it is being recorded and we will share it on our website. So you're welcome to revisit any parts that you maybe want to go over again or share with your colleagues. So look out for that. That'll be up on our website in the coming days. I'd also like to remind you not to forget to register for our upcoming webinars. We have one coming up in 2 weeks on March 1st at 3 p.m. In this webinar, we'll be hearing from Professor Lauren Eichler, who will be presenting on an Indigenous critique of ecocide, genocide, and the human-nature dualism. So we hope to see you all there. And Professor Atapattu, thank you again so much for this presentation. I really learned a lot. It was really eye-opening. And again, thank you to our participants.
Thank you for
Thank
inviting
you.
me. Yeah.
Stay safe, everyone. Take care.
You too. Bye.
Bye.